Hello and welcome to the Fuck It All podcast. My name is Casey Lett Gordon. I'm sitting down today with fellow podcasters, so you know this shit's gonna be good. Margaret Weniger. She is the creator and host of the Rising Tide podcast. I had the incredible opportunity to sit down with Margaret a few months back, and she left me being like, damn, girl, you got a lot to learn. She is a speaker, coach, storyteller, modern woman, and today's guest on the Fuck It All podcast. Margaret, welcome to the show.
Oh, what an intro. I love it. Thank
I
you.
know. It's like as if you were walking out into like the pro wrestling ring. I just hyped you.
Oh, it's so, I think that's what I love about women that like we do that for each other, right? It's just so
Mhm.
amazing and what a gift. So thank you. This is such a treat to be on the other side of things.
I'm wondering if you have the same experience I do. When I'm a guest on podcast, I want to go into interview mode. And it's like a kid that has to sit on their hands to be like, sit your ass down and answer the question. This is not about you right now, Casey.
What's so funny? Because I love being in the spotlight. It's like such a treat to actually be the one getting asked the questions.
You're like
So I
hoping your
think I might
guest.
be the opposite where it's like, oh boy, like I get my chance.
What's your sign?
I'm a Gemini.
Oh my God, my daughter's a Gemini. She loves the spotlight, loves it. The bigger the audience, the better performer. So
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
perfect,
Yep.
perfect. I jokingly tell the story that when I was pregnant and I thought I was having a boy Gemini, I was just convinced I was having a boy. I cried because the only Geminis I knew were Donald Trump and Kanye West.
Oh, ooh, yeah.
Right? That's a lot. But like women Geminis, different energy. But men, I was like, fuck, here we go. So, little side note and course in astrology.
There we go.
Okay. Margaret, I want to give a quick, I mentioned the overview of the work you're doing, your
Yeah.
podcast, but I want to give a little like double click into that and see today's conversation. So, for everybody listening, Margaret is a sales leader turned founder. Anybody recognize something there? She launched Rising Tide to transform the business world by bringing a balance of power between men and women to create environments built for the human being rather than the ideal worker. I love that. It's like we're only workers and employees for the few hours we're in our jobs. We are humans all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Margaret hosts the Rising Tide podcast, a podcast for career driven women to find inspiration, courage, and their voice. All right. Nobody goes from having a 9 to 5 to becoming a founder without their own fuck it all moment. And I find that podcast is the ultimate way to, self accountability / therapy yourself. So tell me how you arrived here, Margaret.
Oh my God. Yes. Well, it's been really interesting because the podcast actually, when I launched Rising Tide, it was a creative outlet. I think
Mhm.
I was definitely at this point of I was running a North American sales team. We were at that point, this was October 2020. So we were 7 months into the lockdown. Our company serviced the salon and spa industry.
Mm.
So our customers were experiencing huge, huge setbacks. Some people were losing their livelihoods. And then internally as a business, we had to make some major changes. So it had been pretty tumultuous. And then you throw in the murder of George Floyd and the important conversations that needed to happen around social justice. It was a very intense year in a role that I was already questioning if I wanted to do. And having the responsibility, my team, we had to consolidate my team down from 70 to, at one point we were down to 15.
Mm.
Which was excruciating. We were able to bring some people back. But, being responsible for these people's day in and day out, knowing that they were also going through their own turmoil of, people in their lives getting COVID and, not knowing, what was happening and having to talk to our customers and hearing these, tough situations that they were in. Really trying to create a space for them that was safe. They could show up as humans. We would,
Mhm.
set aside time to just be and not have it be about business or work, but just, be together. And so I say all of that to say, like, I care deeply about leading. It's a great responsibility and a gift, but it took a toll. And it took a toll because I was pouring everything out and nothing was coming back in.
Mm.
And despite trying to put things in place for myself, I was unable to build enough support around me to fill my cup back up in at the rate at which I was pouring it out. And so October was the creative outlet of, let me do something that fills my cup. Let me do something where I
Mhm.
get to connect with amazing women and hear their incredible stories and put a spotlight on them. And so that was really great. But as we came down to the end of the year, I was just miserable. I was surviving. I was, I would say, just like a shell of a human being. I was in the presence of my family, but I wasn't actually there.
Mhm.
And for anybody who's been there, like it's like it's a horrible feeling, and especially if you're self aware, like you acknowledge what's happening and you can't stop,
Yeah.
which is even worse.
It's like you're on a ride that you can't get
You're
off.
on a ride you can't get off, or like you're just you pushed yourself so far
Mhm.
that you can't stop and figure out how to get out of it. Like, you know that you could, but you don't. And you don't give yourself the time and space. So, thankfully, I was given the gift at the beginning of last year, or 2021, excuse me, where they were consolidating the sales teams and they were eliminating my position. And it was the greatest blessing, because I think one thing I've learned about myself is that I suck at quitting.
Love
And that is a
love
skill
that.
I really want to work on, because I do not know when to let go. I will go down with that ship, gosh darn it, because I made a commitment, and I am still learning the lesson of how to quit and when to quit, and that you're not letting people down when you do it. So if anything, you might be letting people down by not quitting. So that was, I don't, kind of a long-winded way. And then, I'd started the podcast, so I had kind of continued it. But that was that was a huge forcing function where I was pretty badly burned out. I failed to mention I hadn't told the company, but I was about 4 months pregnant too when all of this was going on. So I was pregnant. I was severely burnt out. And then, I was truly given the gift of having my position eliminated. But it was another 2 months before I actually exited, and was able to start trying to, get back to level.
There's a lot there. So I think, COVID has been a giant magnifier for so many of us. I think this is true
Mhm.
across gender. It's been true across age. It's been true across careers of this questioning. I think when you witness so much trauma and fragility of life firsthand, especially in a leadership position where you're having to make decisions or support people in just a very, like you said, human way, not just employee way.
Mhm.
I think that for a lot of people I've heard has actually been a blessing in the sense that they had a shift and a realignment and reconnection with their values and their priorities. It came at a big cost. The second is you explained that you were going through the process of becoming a mother. Was this your first or second child or
Third.
third? Third. Okay, so
Third.
you had an established family at home, children that you were pouring into, a partner that you were with. Then you were also building life while also trying to just like sustain all the roles. And I think this is true whether we are mothers or caregivers or friends or partners. Like, we occupy these really foundational pillars in our communities and families of any kind. And the idea of pouring out and there's a deficit, like the idea of finding time to pour back into yourself feels like a to do within itself.
Mhm.
And so like that can be, talk about like a bad self-fulfilling prophecy there. um I'm curious, like, we talk a lot about mirrors, right? Like, so one of your mirrors held up to you was like, "Hey, we're going to eliminate your position," and you said, "This is actually a gift because it gave me this space. It pulled the cord that I was unable or unwilling to pull for myself." I'm curious, like your family, your friends, like partner, were there any other mirrors looking to you to say like this isn't sustainable, or were they even cognizant or aware of the cracks that you were personally feeling?
Yeah. It's such an interesting time, because I think so many of us all of us were in such survival mode. Things were just changing at such a rapid rate that it was just, you were constantly in that state of like resettling, and that just, that took a toll. And so I think a lot of my, friends and family that would normally maybe catch it weren't, because they were using all of their energy to look inside. I will say I've really come to listen to my husband. He is consistently the one who I have been the worst to, when he's usually very dialed in. He usually sees things well before I do when I'm in environments that are not good, or I'm with somebody who does not appreciate me. And I became a master at telling him he had no idea what he was talking about. So I will
Mm,
say he was very dialed in. He was also very patient with me, because I think he also learned that, like, like any of us, right? We can't force somebody to see something they're not willing to see,
yeah.
and they have to like see it for themselves. So that was, I think that was a huge gift to know that, like, he acknowledged it with me, but he also didn't push me when I wasn't
Mhm.
ready. And he didn't let that become a point of friction between us. He just kind of loved me where I was and let me kind of manage my way. And then, what was fascinating is the mirror of all mirrors was actually the women in the podcast. So what was crazy is I was interviewing these women, and every time I was on an episode, it almost felt like this weird divine intervention of whatever we ended up talking about. It was literally the thing that was weighing on my heart.
Mhm.
And so that also started to become this kind of this much needed kind of affirmation that, like, you can do this, you're okay, like, no, you're not crazy, these are actually quite normal experiences. And so much of what I wanted the podcast to serve as, I was benefiting greatly from, because I was hearing these stories, I could see myself in them. And so that was also very, very helpful in kind of shining this like very bright light and mirror reflecting back of like, there's another way. You do not
Mhm.
need to white knuckle this career of yours. Like,
Yeah.
this is not healthy, because here's somebody else's story telling you exactly, what not healthy looks like. And it's a little bit easier when you can see it looking at somebody else's situation. So yeah, those would, I'd say, the two big things for me, for sure.
Talk about power of story, right?
Mhm.
Stories inform our beliefs, beliefs inform our actions, actions create the systems that we all live and occupy. And so for it all, we talk a lot about the systems that run our lives at work, at home, and in our
Mhm.
communities. And these are so interconnected, right? Of how, what our healthcare and childcare systems create how we then run our families, which create then how we show up at work, and like it is so, they are one and the same. And we are the center of this universe. And I think that's the shift that I personally have had. Is I used to see all these other things as the center of the universe, and I was pouring into them.
Mhm.
And the reframe that I've had just honestly in the past several months is, what happens if I'm the center and each of us are the center of our respective universes? And these, our communities, our work, our partners, our relationships, our families are also pouring into us. And it's this, that reframing. And so when you talk about the stories being one of the major catalysts for you, and then the ability to have conversation, hear this in their words, and then talk through it and see yourself in that, your beliefs started to then be challenged. You were awakened to something else. And then from there, could take action. You and I have a mutual love of the book from Elizabeth Lesser, Cassandra Speaks.
Well, and
That
I
was like
read
our
that.
bond.
That was the other
Yeah.
thing. I read that at the end. It's funny. Glennon Doyle's book Untamed was
Yes.
like the unlock. Like that book was again like a blessing and a curse, because when I read
Totally.
it, that was when I knew there had been a voice talking to me that I had been trying to keep tamped down.
Yeah.
So that unrest, that's when that unrest kicked in with
Yeah.
like, is this really the work I want to be doing? Is this really where I want to be? And then when I read Cassandra Speaks, I was on fire. That was like, I think November or December of 2020. And woo,
Yep.
the floodgates opened.
Yeah. It really did, and I'm so grateful for both of those women telling these stories, both personal as well as this anthology of like how our
Yes.
stories have been told from the
Yes.
beginning of time. Because I don't know why, maybe this is true of people, but as women, the first thing we think often when we experience something that isn't just straight up joy, we're like, I'm the only one and I'm totally crazy. The fuck? Like, you don't look and say, like, I'm happy. I must be the only one. Everybody's like, I love that you had this community, that you were also fostering it. We say that we're for the women with a restless discontent for something more and a bias to create it. And you started with the bias to create it. You said, I needed a creative outlet. And I think for so many women, especially those listening, like this proverbial all, and we'll talk about that because I know you have your own relationship with it all. I think it's like the biggest advice that I would give, or learning, because I don't really believe in advice, because who am I? But the learning I've had is just taking action. Even if it's the wrong one, it puts you in a mindset of like, this is not an immovable experience. There is not permanence here. And I have a will, and I have ideas, and I have creativity, and I have a way forward. And so the fact that you started there, I can't imagine the confidence that gave you of just saying like, I'm doing something for myself.
Yeah, it was, it's so interesting. I've been thinking a lot about this concept lately of, um, it doesn't seem to get easier, like I kind of keep waiting for it to like get easier to maybe in some ways still defy what is social conditioning for women, of that, like putting in healthy boundaries, of kind of checking in with ourselves first before checking on others, right? These things that are just so ingrained in us not to do. When we
Mm-hmm.
look at our careers, even men and women can relate to this, right? It's like that whole linear path of like, you move up and to the right, it's climb, 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 like go to school, get an education, get a great job, and ascend, 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 ascend.
Mm-hmm.
And so I look at it as, for so many of us that are having these conversations and trying to understand ourselves deeper, to give ourselves what we need, to identify where our energy lies, it's ahead of the curve. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we are still very much ahead of the curve. And oftentimes when you're ahead of the curve, you're misunderstood. And the world will try to put you back where it wants you, and where, kind of to keep order. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, of, this kind of giving yourself what you need, and allowing yourself to live in your fullest potential, right? Like, in a lot of ways, like that is still very much ahead of the curve for women. And so, like, I'm coming to peace with, like, that means this battle, this journey is not always going to be easy. And it certainly will be one that many do not understand, but there are women like you, and there are so many out there that do. And so, you know, instead of seeing all the ones that don't, find the ones that do, that can go on that with you.
Obsessed with that. And you and I were talking before we hit record. So you and I both have been building our audiences in podcast. FYI, neither of us were podcasters before. We both worked in sales and never had done this before. Probably both were used to having like full scale marketing teams and not being the Jane of all trades that we find ourselves in today.
Mhm.
The difference between being for everyone versus being for an engaged few.
Mm.
And this is true. Like, I find this in personal life and my own growth and comfort with who I am, as well as in business and how we measure success. And your work is specifically focused on career driven women, which I really like the honing in on that, because so many of us, the classic quote unquote, it all, the
Mhm.
first thing that comes to all of our minds is the tension between work and family. We want these big, bold, really successful careers, and we want to be able to have family in whatever capacity. Most often, that means some sort of partner and children.
Mhm.
And when we think about that, talking about being for everyone in your personal life, not having an opinion, being like the vanilla of it, like vanilla love her, but she's not going to be bold enough to really change something. She's not going to be polarizing. So many of us sit in that space because it leads to more open opportunities, or at least the perception is early in our lives. The same is true in work, is like, if I can say yes to everything, if I can always be there, then I'll be the one that's, really dependable. And in building these companies, I think both of us have this in common because we were just talking about it. It's really easy to be like, am I getting to everyone? Does every woman out there find value? And the reframing is like, who are the few that are so
Yeah.
ingrained with us, like in our communities, in our work, in our mission and this movement that we're trying to facilitate and invite other women into. If you're for everyone, you're for no one. But living with that on the inside is really freaking hard.
It really is, and it's such a hard thing to, I'll give you a perfect example. I think one of the things with rising tide that is important is, I do believe that the problem I aim to solve is one that affects everyone in corporate America. Man and woman, like men just as much as women are having difficulty at work, they're unhappy, their struggles, and they may be different, but they're discontent as well for different reasons. And so, it's been really interesting as, I find when I have conversations, like, I don't think rising tide is in a place yet where it's ready to address men. And that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that they're not welcome, but it's more like it's really interesting when I have a conversation with women and I talk about it. It's like the light bulb instantly goes on, and I know, like, I'm speaking to my audience. I'm speaking to who I need to be speaking to right this moment.
Mhm.
When I speak about it with men, there's this moment where I see the eyes glaze. And I
Mhm.
don't think it's malicious in any way, but it's
Yes.
just right. It's like there's a unintentional checking out. And so I've had to make the very conscious choice of, do I craft the message in a way to appeal to them, or is that something that can wait? Because that's not really that important yet. Like,
Yeah.
I don't need to worry about that. And so that's been a really, again, a really recent thing where it's like, at some point this is absolutely about, I would say, people in their corporate careers that are probably in their 30s and 40s. It's not just about women, but today I need to focus on that ambitious woman that feels that restless discontent, that,
Mhm.
has big dreams and big ambitions, and we need her to live in her fullest potential, because that is how the world gets better.
Mhm.
And so that's where I focus, but it's hard, you have to be so disciplined. It's so hard to see something and know it, but not do something about it.
Yes, and I really appreciate you saying that because it's not about an exclusivity. It's that the relevance is more for the ambitious career woman. But should there be curious minds, this is a place where this content can be really relevant, really empowering, um, creating community, etc. The discipline I find like I thought that my business would be one thing and that's where I'd be disciplined have need to have discipline, but I've realized as a founder that especially the a founder whose personal experience and pain created and birthed the business and the movement that we're working on,
Right?
they are not mutually exclusive. They are so closely intertwined, and so the amount of growth that I've had in the past year and a half has been so exponential to any other period in my life. And so I think oftentimes this idea around, I'm curious your take on this. We talk a lot about, and I want this because you're in the career space, scalable normally is like the number one goal when you talk in business. It's repeatable and scalable, repeatable and scalable. And right, you and I have been in sales, like we get that. And we have been talking a lot about like scale is important, but I actually want sustainability of the individual, of the model, of the culture, of the I want a sustainable company that also can be scalable. But what you were just saying, like to do men, women, all employees, that is not sustainable today. That's just like how do we exacerbate or strip out all the value before it's ready? And there's discipline in incubating an idea.
Mhm. Oh my gosh, so much. Okay, so I have like a million thoughts and like reactions as you were talking about that. Like my brain, I
Perfect.
really need to create a more loving term for it. I call it squirrel moments, where my brain like shoots off in five directions at the same time.
I love it.
So a couple of things. One thing that you talked about of like with your company and how you're thinking about it and what you're focusing on, and then letting it kind of iterate and evolve. One thing I've learned from the women that I've interviewed is that the most successful women, it's really interesting. I've called it open ended goals, And I
Mm,
just recently was listening to Emmanuel Acho, who he just came out with a book, Illogical. And he was on a podcast with Brene Brown, and he talked about focusing on objectives. And so, like, the idea was that a goal is an end toward which energy is directed, but an objective, by definition, is energy directed towards something. And so
mm.
what's great about an objective and not a goal for your kind of your vision and your life and whatever you're setting out to achieve is that it's directional in nature, but it allows you freedom and flexibility to evolve as you acquire new information. And so I
Without a feeling of failure,
without a
I would
feeling,
assume.
right. So I love it because it keeps you on track and it keeps you moving towards the ultimate outcome, but it allows you to make the necessary changes so that you can ultimately get to where you're trying to be. Where a goal, it can be very narrow and focused. And so you could achieve it, but actually not actually get to your ultimate outcome. So I thought that was a really great way of him talking about it. And I've absolutely seen that as
Mhm.
like that's one of the behaviors of the women of the podcast. The other thing I wanted to hit on is when you're talking about sustainable and scalable. I would say, in my experience, this is where there is inherent friction.
Mm,
And I would say as a leader, my default was more towards uh, how do we strike the balance of both? How do we create a space that is sustainable, but also it scales, right? Like I
mhm,
understand, like there are business objectives and there are employee priorities, and so how do we make it so
mhm,
that it's not all business and it's not all employee centric? It's this beautiful balance. And what I have learned is that that takes a lot of extra energy to do it because it tends to make you have to do more creative problem solving. The easier
mm.
solutions typically are going to favor the company. And so what ends up happening is, you do things. I love it. Simon Sinek talks about this in The Infinite Game. And it's this idea of like we play a finite game in an infinite game. Business, there is no winning at business, right? Like infinite games, like there is no winner. The goal is to stay in the game as long as possible, right? So
Mm,
people can come and go. The rules can change whenever they want, right? But finite is time bound. There's specific rules. There's winners and losers. And so a lot of what can happen when we're scaling is we try to put this infinite game and use a finite
mhm.
strategy. And then that tends to be where, that's where it's the heartache comes. That's where the friction comes. That's where the disconnect
Mhm.
between human beings feeling like ideal workers comes. So I think that's, I love that sustainable and scalable because it really requires creativity from leadership, but it can absolutely be done. But it's also I think that's where I see women can bring that kind of sustainable energy typically into the room to
Yeah.
balance out that, the like get results quickly, the heroic efforts, the big peaks, but also with big peaks come low valleys, and
Yeah.
rather than just kind of the sustained success.
Yeah, and I think there is a level of education around the power of inherently feminine traits or energy. What we're talking about is
Mhm.
this balance of masculine and feminine, which exists within us all. We've talked about it a lot here on the show.
Yeah.
And women as equaled and valued architects. Like, we can't have women or any diverse or traditionally underrepresented perspective at the table and expect them to act like the rest of the group. It's not like, oh my God, check the box, they're here. Just pretend to be just like this other, very specific masculine. And historically, throughout business, it's white men, educated white, but like we have to call that out. Um, just be like that. The value in actually having them there is to create the space to say, what is your superpower? What are the gaps that you see? And allowing them to contribute in a way that is just as profound
Mhm.
as the like traditional, like you said, heroic peaks that we're seeking. And I think that facilitate creating spaces, proverbial and real safe spaces to have these conversations, to call in and not slap the wrist and say, hey, this is all fucked up, but to say, like, hey, there's opportunity to be better. Like, that's nobody wants to be called out, especially in a professional world. What does that equal? You're fired, you're canceled, that's not the intent here. What we want to do is create sustainable change where people feel excited about how much better it can be. There's a hopefulness. That's one thing I loved in Cassandra Speaks is she ends on hope. It's like
Mhm.
we can sit in the absolute, awful of it all, or we can try to hold on to some hope here and imagine a world that we can all be excited about. And so just really love this conversation. I want to pivot us a little bit towards
Mhm.
your personal story.
Mhm.
So you can have it all, baby. Talk to me about your relationship with the proverbial all and
Yeah.
what that has looked like over your career and your life and where it is today, and maybe some things you've learned along the way or unlearned, as we
Yeah.
like to say.
Ooh, it's so funny because I I don't know if I ever thought about having it all, but I do know I would be damned if I didn't have this incredibly successful career and have the family. So I don't think I ever thought of it about it as having it all, but I think it was more like I can have both, because to me,
Mm,
like it all is like all the things, right? It's like I have great friendships and I am part of my community and I have my spiritual well-being. And, for me, it wasn't all of those things. It was like, I'll do these two things and, screw, screw whatever has happened before. I can do it. Ah,
yeah, I feel that, girl. I feel
oh,
that.
the naive mindset. And I think what was really interesting was, um, what it all, if I look at it in hindsight, it shifted so fundamentally when I had my first child.
Mm,
And I remember I was at a, you know, quickly scaling, high growth, future unicorn.
uh-huh.
Um, and I remember like when he was born, it was like everything changed except I didn't want it to. And
Mm,
so it was like I was very angry. When I went back to work, I was very angry because I was at a classic startup where the average person was single or maybe newly married. I was the first mother at the company. And so that was a whole journey in and of itself. And I so
mhm.
desperately wanted to fit in. And so, it's like I just refused to lean into who I was becoming. And I just fought it tooth and nail. And I look back on it and oh God, if I could shake her, like I just made myself so miserable. And I did it in lots of areas. Like I was a college swimmer and being an athlete, like in so many ways, if you've seen Encanto, like, oh God, I can't remember her name, but the big, strong sister.
Louisa.
Yeah. Like I so identify with her and that
Mhm.
like physically strong means I can shoulder a lot. So it's like
Yep.
for me, physical strength is very important for like mental and emotional strength. And so same thing, I was like merciless to myself physically because I was like pushing myself, but I had all these new taxing things that were happening. I was just so unaware and so unbelievably cruel to myself. And
Mm.
so, you think when you face adversity, do you treat yourself with compassion or cruelty? And I was unbelievably cruel. Like the way I treated myself, I would never treat another human being. And so
Yeah.
I've kind of gone off the answer to the question, but I think what I started to learn the very hard way is that I had to wake up to this new reality. As a mother, the rules were different. And I was now facing things I had never faced before. And with that reality also came this incredible gain, which was all of a sudden I had been welcomed into this community
Mm.
of
Mhm.
mothers. And for the first time in my life, I'd always been a guy's girl. For the first time in my life, I felt this intense kinship to women.
Mhm.
And I felt this deep empathy for other human beings. I now was so much kinder in general. I was, because I just, when people showed me compassion, I knew how that made me feel.
Mhm.
And when people acknowledged that I was doing the best that I could and that was enough, that the way that made me feel, and it's changed me forever in the best way. So I think having it all, I'm not there at all of figuring out like how do I create this balance where I truly feel like I am able to run the way I want to run, but I'm also showing up. And I don't know if I'll ever find the perfect balance, but I will say that it is really hard.
Mhm.
And just by default of loving work, I've always wished, I'm like, I would love to know what it's like to want to be a stay-at-home mom.
Mhm.
I want to know what that feels like, because then that would be what society expects of me. That somehow feels like I wouldn't be fighting this uphill battle. And like what would life look like if I fit in more with what was my gender role, as opposed to feeling like I'm constantly defying it in spaces that most people like me are not in. So
Mhm.
that was a lot.
No,
It
it was
kind of took
so
us a few places there.
that's the beauty of this because that's what good ones do anyways. And so a couple of things that you said there, I think that this cruelty to ourselves,
Mm,
I really appreciate that you said, this was pieces that you'd seen in your earlier self, like, right, like being an athlete and in this physically really strong shape, like, and in some areas probably a hardcore approach probably merited different results. Like, right, the harder you train, the better you perform. Like there was some sort of correlative behavior over time. But as we both know, emotionally, like that's not normally the case. It's not like the more you beat the shit out of yourself emotionally, the stronger you're going to be. It's like, nah, baby, you're just going to be on the floor crying. Um, and I felt that too. Like I felt my sister and I talked a lot about this. Her episode has been on the show. I think it's called Break Up with Him, which is just hilarious to me. But she said that she couldn't wait to return to work after maternity leave because she was so tired at being bad at things and
mm,
doing so many new things. She's like, I just want to go where I know what to do and I know how to be good at that. And that you think about like if we were to observe anybody else talking to themselves that way, I love what you said, like I wouldn't talk to other people that way. And probably if you heard someone being talked to that way, you'd be like, what the hell? But somehow it's like this perception of ourselves being so tough that we just need more tough love. Like that, what a broken thing. And for me, and I've talked about it on the show, it was this driving home and wanting to drive my car off the road. It was Glennon Doyle's Be Motherhood is a Model, Not a Martyrdom kept ringing in my
mhm.
head. And this, you're doing this because it's quote unquote in service of all these other areas. But if you're not here, is that really in service of all these areas? Right? Like that's, and then two, you're modeling a behavior that one way or another, the future will also model, whether it's your child or other generations or your community or the people you lead and mentor at work. Like it's not just through motherhood. I don't think that has to be the only lens, but with this power, with more visibility, with more influence, I think the ability to stop and say, let's just not perpetuate really old, bad, very dangerous narratives.
Mhm.
Let's say, what would we have liked to have seen differently ourselves and creating the space for that. And I just really appreciate you talking about that because I feel like a lot of times we talk about like it was really bad and now it's really good, but we don't talk about the growth and like the gray area that happened between step 1 and step 5. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and it's so interesting because I think I was listening to Maya Shankar's podcast, A Slight Delay of Plans. I think that's what it's called.
Great
Anyways.
name.
Yeah, and she was interviewing uh of course I can't remember her name, but maybe I can get you the link so people can reference it. But
Yeah.
she was talking about so quitting, and I was just recently listening to this. But what was really interesting is she talks about kind of this like status quo bias, and how as human beings we are wired, right? We are wired to stick with the thing that we know, even if we don't like it, because it's familiar to us. It's
Yeah.
perceived as better than the possibility of something better, but it's unknown. And I think again, what I've found for myself is the more that I can learn about how our brain works, psychology of the mind, that has been really helpful, because it just be my behaviors, I can look at them so much more objectively. It's
Mm,
not this like, am I the only one that thinks this? Like, what's wrong with you? It's much more of
yes.
like, oh, that's what that is. Like I can actually give
Yep.
names to
Yes.
things, as opposed to, thinking that I'm, kind of off on my own island having these thoughts and feelings when this is actually quite a normal wiring for most,
Yes.
most human beings. So
Yeah.
I think that's the other piece that's really interesting is that bias of kind of, going back to what we know because it's familiar, being in a place where we can, we know we can add value. Or, I think about transitioning into rising tide. It's been the gravitational pull to go back to, running a sales organization or, running the go to market group at a company. It's like, it's only a gravitational pull because it's familiar.
Yes.
And I have, I have experience and people will listen to me there where I'm still transitioning that, to this new arena. And so that has been really
Mm.
interesting to go through that process and like, I think it's good to question, like, does that still make sense? And for me personally, yes, it absolutely makes sense to not return. Like that is not, I've
Mhm.
seen kind of glimpses of myself through consulting work, and I see what version of me shows up and I don't like it. And when I see myself in rising tide work, I really love who I become. And so that to me has been very informative of kind of helping me realize, as much as I would love to go back to what I know and
Mhm.
where, I can do amazing things, I'm not my best self. And that best self is worth giving life to.
Lately, there's been two concepts that have come up between my business partner and I. We do a mastermind group. It's come up there, and it's the
Mm,
idea of shedding and expansion.
mhm,
And in like historic text, a lot of times they talk about the snake as being like, deviant, but actually the snake has been a sign of power because it's ability to shed old skin and become something new. Like that's a part
mm,
of natural evolution. So while there are some schools of thought that it can be, representative of negative, it actually also has a very positive alignment with growth or significance with growth, and then expansion. And I love what you said of like, I'm not my fullest potential, and that goes back to what we said at the beginning around objectives versus goals
mhm.
assumes there's some sort of finite destination, and then it's like, and I'm done. Right, like, and that does feel good. I love to check off a to-do list, but let's not put our life on the same playing field as completing laundry. Like those do not need to be at the same, like we're talking about the big game here, like you mentioned. And so I wonder, just in today's conversation, this all
Mm,
it's a lifetime pursuit, right? Like I want at the end of my life, God willing, 60 years from now, 70 years from now, to say I had it all within a life, but not having to say like I'm having this finite moment of it all, because that assumes it's going to go away. And I also think that it gives a lot more peace for those of us that love like a scalable up into the right kind of growth. It's like, well, what if we measured it over our life and not just a year, not just this finite moment? And for those of us ambitious women that have accomplished a lot early in our careers, can we all just say, like, it's because maybe it wasn't that hard for us and the hard work is actually to go do this other thing? So, had it taken you 20 years to do it, then that would have been your life's work, but it didn't. It took you 5 or 10 or whatever. Now, go do
mhm.
the big thing. Go play in the truly big leagues, which is creating movements, creating new systems, creating new ways of being, families, communities, etc. Like, yeah,
Oh my
having it all, it's the big game.
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts. I'm like taking my notes here so I don't forget. Again, lots, I love when I have conversations and my brain sparkles because I know that that's when it's like a really great
Yes.
conversation because it's going in so many directions. And listening to you talk about it, I think on this concept of like it all is it like there is no final destination, right? It's very much this finite, or not finite, it's an infinite game of having it all.
Yes.
And so I've really, through listening to the interviews that I've done, and I do listen to them, it's so great because I interview, then I listen back to them, and then I listen to them again once they go live, so I get like 3 doses of it.
Mhm.
And we've interviewed over 55 women now, and what I found is that like this idea of it all, like there's kind of these 3 things that I'm seeing that are really important to understand when we talk about like, I can have it all. I feel very strongly like I'm taking the stance of like, you can have it all, but let me tell you what I mean by that.
Mm.
Because to me, like it all, it's like it changes as your life changes. So like how you define it all, that is not a static thing. It's kind of this ongoing evolution. So like kind of like
Mhm.
what you're saying, right? It's like that is it all evolves as you evolve. And
Mm.
then it is defined by you and only you.
Yes,
So
baby, yes.
having it all is unique to the individual. So it might be a common term that we can use to understand one another, but somebody's individual definition of having it all is going to be different than yours. And then the other thing is that, you know, having it all is, I very much believe the reason I say you can have it all is that it's aligned to what's important and a priority at this point in time. So it's not about, do I have success in all of the dimensions of my life? It's what dimensions are important to me that I want to put my energy into, and I focus there. And again, those can change over time. So to me, like as I think about having it all, like those are kind of the big things that are I've really understood about, like, can you have it all? 100% I believe you can,
Mm.
but the expectation is that these things is that's how we define it all. It's these kind of three things that we look at. So, um and then the other thing too is like I really encourage you, uh can you answer, if you could have right, if like you could have it all, what does that even look like?
Yep.
Because I will tell you a very personal story. I had this was probably end of 2020. I was talking with my coach and we were in a session and she asked me the question. She said, "Okay, well, what do you want?" And she always loves to ask the question, if you could have it the way you want it, what does it look like? And I started crying because my mind was completely blank.
Mhm.
Like just absolutely blank. I like I didn't even know where to start. And what I was grappling with was this painful realization that I had for so long been so focused on these other things that I had lost complete touch with who I was and what I wanted. Like what seems like such a simple question. And yet I could
Mhm.
not answer it. And honestly, it took months to try to figure it out because it had been years and years and years of ignoring it. Not asking that question. So I think that's the other piece of this is like, don't panic. If you ask yourself of like, what does it mean to have it all and you can't answer it, that's okay. That's your starting point. Great. There's work to be done. Just start there.
Yeah, and I think the idea that, like, so often we think that the, like, knowing so I compare it to starting the business. Us
Mhm.
saying to the world, like, "Hey, we're starting a business." Everybody thinks that's the hard part. Like, "Babe, that's as easy as it's ever gonna be. Now go build the business." And so I lately have been saying to myself, you are the least experienced you will ever be in your life right now. You will only get more experience.
Yes.
You are the least successful by my own definition that you will ever be in this life right now. You are, the like youngest you'll ever be married at this moment, and right, like, and trying to reframe it instead of this like, oh my
Mm.
god, how big and hard is it going to be ahead of me? It's like, it's only going to get easier in some way because I'm only going to be having more experiences, more learnings, more expansion, to use our words earlier. And so the work starts once you take a peek inward. Like, that's the I think it's the most fulfilling work, but it's certainly the most cumbersome. But that's where we talk about this pivot from a fuck it all moment to a fuck it all mindset. The mindset is the willingness to continue to return, and you build that muscle. And it's everything from what do I want for dinner tonight all the way to what do I want with my life.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean, I love that, and it is. It's okay to not know, you know? I mean, I think, like, that's just to your point, it's like, that's just where you are, right?
In
It's like,
this moment.
all that tells you is, like, you are here.
Right.
On
We're
the
looking at the
on the
mall
map
map.
of self-awareness, like, this is your starting point, and,
Yes.
like, now go educate yourself, and there's, like, really simple
Mhm.
things you can do, right? It's like, pay attention to the things that light you up, pay attention to the things that drain you, what interactions, just get you so excited, and what
Yep.
things are you just dreading doing, like it becomes this really fun exploration of who are you, and kind of taking this objective curiosity as opposed to, you know yeah, like getting overwhelmed by it. It's like, well, this is going to be an interesting this is going to be an interesting journey, and like at least I'm starting somewhere.
At least I'm starting. I know more today than I did yesterday, which is
Yes.
I don't know what I want. So
Well,
great. I now know that.
I love you said it at the beginning, and I meant to say something then. I want to come back to it now, which is this idea of like the getting started piece. I think one thing, again, what I've seen through all of these podcasts, it's just this amazing thing where, I'm talking with women who have 10, 15, 20, 30-year careers. And in hindsight, it all makes sense. It
Yep.
all perfectly makes sense. And I actually have a podcast coming out next week that says like the new career path is actually up and to the right. It is a straight linear line. But when we're looking at, are we aligned and are we focusing on living our potential? Then when we focus on those things, yes, you should have a straight line up and to the right. But what's so great about it is like they started. And so often where they started was not where they ended up. But because they started, they were able to gain new information. And as they gained new information, it informed their future decisions. And 2, 3, 6 steps later, they found it. And so they would never have found it, though, if they had never started. So I think there's such beauty in the just start, get out of analysis paralysis. There's literally nothing, probably besides murder that can't be undone.
Yep.
So go. Like, if there's
Yep.
something holding you back, like, go do it. What's the
Repeat
worst that happens? You are
repeat to me
smart. You can
again.
figure this out.
Yes, you are resourceful, smart, whole human being, but repeat to
Yes.
me again the chart aligned
Oh,
and
yeah, potential. So if you're focusing on saying, in our careers, right? We are taught, again, right? Go to college, get a great education, get a great job,
yep,
climb the corporate ladder,
right,
stay in your lane, right?
right.
Pick an industry, pick a role, and go at that with all your ferocity. And that's why paths are squiggly, right? We're learning now that actual careers, we all have multiple careers in us.
Yep.
And so, and like that model of like stay in your lane, stay in your focus, like that like if you think about who that actually serves, it serves kind of that old structure of like that serves the companies, right? Like,
Yes, baby.
and so instead, when we prioritize, kind of that alignment, which is knowing of self, who am I, what's important to me, where do I want to put my energy, what are,
Yep.
what dimensions of my life get my time and energy, and we focus on developing ourselves, that's when our career path is actually quite a very straight line. And again, when we look back in hindsight, it's all very clear. It's not a squiggly mess. It's actually quite straight.
Obsessed, obsessed, obsessed. Okay, I got a couple rapid fire for you.
Oh, yay.
When do you feel most in your power?
Oh. Oh crap. I had two answers. One is these kinds of conversations.
Mhm.
And the second thing is it is when I'm speaking on a
Yeah.
stage.
Yeah. All right, inverse. Finish this sentence for me.
Mm.
When my power is shaken, I.
Hmm. Now, I try to take a step back and go do something that refocuses my mind. That's a very new behavior, but it's, for me, it's physical activity, but recognizing I'm not in my best self and shifting gears,
Mhm.
not plowing through. That was an old behavior.
Yep.
So it's kind of shifting gears, maybe stepping away. I'm doing something that recenters me.
Yep. Yeah, I love that. Owning a new behavior and
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that you're developing something new.
Mm-hmm.
For you, what is the best part of being a woman?
Hmm. Oh my God.
I know. Editing makes these rapid fire, but they are never rapid.
You know what I will say about this is I'll give very personal, I think, answer is that like for me, I see it as it has been because I am not a naturally empathetic person. Being a woman has allowed me to, without having lived somebody's experience, understand the emotions that they experience. As a woman, I can connect to, although not experiencing what it's like to be judged by the color of my skin, I can still understand what it's like to be judged by external factors.
Mhm.
As a mother, I think under like having experienced the compassion that I was given, like that has made me a more empathetic person. And there's just this deep kinship that I just don't know again, motherhood's not for everyone, but I know for me personally, like I think that has been a gift of being able to connect and relate to people in a new way. And so for me being
Mhm.
a woman, there's been this gift of like really deep, meaningful connection
Mhm.
as a result of being a woman.
Mm, beautiful. Who do you admire?
I really should have prepped better for these questions.
No, I love it. I want the real deal. I don't want a scripted answer, and it
Oh
can
my
be big.
gosh.
It can be the big names. It can be someone personal.
Yeah. I gosh, it's so interesting. It's so hard because I in so many ways like I admire like I'll give it it's a two-part answer. So I admire everyone that's been on the podcast, you included,
Mhm.
because what I see is that each person who's on there um there is this self-possession where they are either on the journey to truly understand themselves or they are really kind of operating at this really high capacity and with wisdom and grace. And so I've just a deep admiration for every woman that I've interviewed that has been on the podcast and for different reasons, but such a deep
Mhm.
admiration. Um, I've really, I think I would love to give names of like big people. I have people that I like admire in the sense that like I think they put out really great content that transforms
Right.
people. But I mean, I think if I'm honest with myself, it's the women that I connect with that are on the podcast.
Mhm. I love that, and I think, like you said, when you get to know people in this way and you see these people facing some of the most challenging moments in their life and owning that's self-possession, that's a beautiful term.
Mhm.
I think admiration shifts. Like, it
Mhm.
goes from being this, like, big, headline name somewhere to these, like, deeply personal stories and connections. So
Yeah.
I very much empathize with that.
Yeah.
What are you reading right now?
Mm. Mm. Okay, so I'm reading The Work Won't Love You Back by
Love it.
Sarah Sarah Jaffe.
Jeffy, right?
Yes, I think that's correct. Yeah, so I'm that one's been really interesting. It's definitely dense, but it's very informative as far as taking a look at each of the different industries and kind of
Mhm.
some, kind of shifts that the pandemic exploited of like
Okay.
industries that were very much kind of capitalizing on people's love or passion for the work but not
Mhm.
necessarily paying people or treating people the way that they should be treated. So it's a very interesting read. I've really enjoyed learning about some new industries that I've never worked in.
Mhm.
So I'm very like that one's been really great. And then I'm also kind of like on the side reading Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown, which is
Yeah.
a little bit more textbook in form, but
Yep.
ooh, some of her like I love the way she talks about perfectionism in there. I find that it's a very compelling piece of work and definitely I think a great resource book to just have.
Yeah, I just finished reading that earlier this year, and it's well, it has similar components of her traditional work or her other work. It
Mhm.
is a bit more academic, but I thought it was probably the most digestible academic book I've read.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
I mean, I
yeah,
think she does that beautiful balance of like she is this hardcore academic, but she makes it relatable
yeah,
to the
yeah,
masses.
completely.
Yeah.
What's the best advice you've ever been given?
Hmm. I don't know if it's the specific phrase, but I think the sentiment has been, when you are whole, you can fully show up for others. And to me that has been I think a great reframe to remind myself of like pushing through when I'm tired, when I'm stressed, like that serves nobody. And the people that I care deeply about, it could hurt them, not help them.
Mm,
And so I think that has been really helpful of reframing how I think about, my self-care and kind of my mental headspace because, you know, I want to show up fully for the with people when I'm with them. And so if I don't take care of myself, then I can't do that for
mm,
them. And so, again, work in progress, not always good at it, but I think that's been something that's been a really helpful kind of unlocking
Mhm.
advice that I've received from multiple people, multiple forms, but that's kind of
Yeah.
the distilled version of the inputs.
I love it. Final question, younger Margaret, what are you telling her?
It's not so much what I'm telling her, it's what she's telling me. It's been really interesting. Again, I keep referring to the podcast, but like one thing I really noticed is that so many of the women kind of reconnected with who they were before, like right as they were entering the corporate world. And she's been talking to me a lot of like, you know, you have fire. You don't take crap from anyone, So I've really been kind of reconnecting with that, like,
Mhm.
things are possible and like I can make a difference in this world. I will make a change and like I like get out of the way. Like come with me or get out of the way. And not in a mean way, but it's more
Yes.
so of like a not not cowering. Like a little
Well,
piece of me I think
self-expression,
just
right?
yeah, there was this little piece of me that I just honestly did not understand had been chipped away over the last decade. And I think the very subtle messaging of like who you are isn't really right.
Mhm.
Fit, kind of put yourself over here and then you'll belong. And so in an effort to belong, in an effort to fit in an effort to, succeed, I kind of morphed myself away from her. So I think if anything, she's talking back at me being like, remember who you are. You
Oh,
are ferocious. You are strong. You are capable and you can do anything you set your mind to. And don't you dare let somebody steal your fire.
I love that. That's been like the coolest answer I've gotten for that one is younger you talking to today you. And I think so many of us, I mean, feel that in this reconnection with our former self and remembering who we were before the world got a hold of us.
Right. Who we are, right? It's like she
Yeah.
might have just gotten buried under some layers, but it's like she's
Yeah.
been there all along. It's just let's get some of those layers off of her.
Yes. Shedding, shedding, shedding,
Shedding,
shedding.
shedding, shedding.
All right, Margaret, this has been such a fabulous conversation. I knew it would be. Your Rising Tide podcast it's for career-driven women to have a place to go to hear these stories, to connect with each other. For our listeners, you can listen to Rising Tide podcast wherever you get your pods. And then I want to make sure I have the exact name correct for Instagram and TikTok. What we'll invite you to do, and we'll be sure to put this in the show notes, but it's Rising Tide podcast. So that's on both Instagram and TikTok. Margaret's distilling all of these deep learnings she has across, these 50 plus conversations with women and growing, and being able to put this into digestible career and life hacks, perspectives, advice. And I just love what you're doing. Thank you for being on the show.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for having me and thank you for the work that you're doing. I just think this is so powerful to allow people to have access to this kind of information and we're all going to be better by working together.
Mm, yes. I hope this is not the end of where it all in Rising Tides collaborate, because I think there's a lot of magic here.
Yes. Agreed. Agreed.